Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and with this video, I'll be discussing my thoughts on episode 6 of the anime series Log Horizon 2. Very captivating and intriguing episode, I have to say, at least for me personally, who's always had this sort of inquisitive nature with the realm within which these characters find themselves, this sort of MMORPG framework, where, going back to the very first episode of Season 1, they sort of woke up after this patch was supposed to be delivered to this MMORPG they were playing, and they called it the Apocalypse, because they woke up within this real-world framework that still very much operates under MMORPG sort of guidelines and rules, but they've always found since that time, all through Season 1 especially, that they could bend the rules and they could manipulate things by hand. For example, the food, when accessed by menus, was very flavorless, tasteless, and they found if they got these ingredients together to make the food by hand, they could actually make real-world, very tasty food. And there was that whole thing about Shiro, selling the burgers to everybody in Akibahara and that kind of thing. They made a lot of their money. This was one of the strongholds within which they led, the round table to be formed and everything like that of all the different guilds. And so it's been very fascinating, that sort of level of this series, not only the character interplay and the ongoing story of trying to keep these people together as a unification, that kind of thing, all these characters working in tandem, but also the world surrounding them has still very much been an interest of mine, because unlike another series like this, SAO, there's no sort of worrying about being killed in the real world, and what is the real world? What is this environment they find themselves in? Is still very much a question. They're not so, ramped up about getting the hell out of there. At least, maybe that's the long-term goal, but of course Shiro has had manipulative sort of things for the greater good that he's been doing instead. So the focus in this particular episode, where we have a scene with Roderick, and we find out that sort of the genders of characters, if a male character has chosen a female character to play as and is embodying in this world, as well as vice versa, they're seeing that the people are basically transforming, or I guess you could say conforming, to that particular gender, whether that means emotionally or vocally, the sound of their voice, maybe even mentally, those kinds of things. So people are being manipulated into whatever form they've chosen, and that's very intriguing, because it also plays into the idea of flavor text, sort of the descriptive information that goes into the formation of materials and items, is having sort of different kinds of effects, inexplicably so, to the surroundings. And of course, the entire area is actually expanding exponentially, and they're not quite sure why. Is this to make more room for sort of more lambs to the slaughter? Who knows? These are the overhanging questions that this episode basically puts in my mind. But then, of course, we also have, sort of the largest chunk of this episode is dealing with Akatsuki in this almost incorporeal, between realm. She was killed at the tail end of the last episode by this roving, serial killer, but she's in this almost limbo where she has a dream. It's the first time we ever see Akatsuki as she may really appear in the real world, that she left behind, and she's climbing stairs, and she gets to the top, and then she's falling, like implying a lack of control in her trying to escape or find her way. And then, of course, she's back in her sort of in-game form and finds Shiro on a beachhead where they sort of spend time together. There's a sort of metaphor of him clipping his own hair, because she may have experienced the loss of a memory, which is very intriguing when she does eventually come out of this limbo and respawns and that kind of thing. There's something she knew she had to do, but she doesn't seem quite certain anymore as to what it was. Maybe that was that memory dissolving. And of course we see characters like Riaz and Lanessia talking very much about trying to help Akatsuki find her way so that they can unify and they can put all their strengths together. And once Akatsuki does finally respawn and come out of it, she has a new resolve. She understands that for Shiro's sake, for everyone's sake, she has to pick up the slack where his being absent has faltered. She has to sort of being a unifying presence, if you will. And I love seeing that Marielle, Henrietta, even though they're kind of scolding her for trying to take it all upon herself, they are still championing the idea that, they can work together and that kind of stuff. And then, of course, we see Krusty's sort of better half, if you will, his second in command, I guess you could say, this chick, I forget her name off the top of my head. Her weapon is coming to life. It seems to be manipulating itself and acting very strangely, and of course then it goes on the attack. Krusty jumps in the way, and he, for all intents and purposes, has disappeared from this environment? Was he transported elsewhere? Was he completely disintegrated? Has he now found himself back in the real world, whatever that is, contemporary to this environment? Remains to be seen. Of course, the chick in question lost part of her arm in the exchange, and that's all kinds of freaky, especially with some of my viewers commenting on my previous video about Sujiro's weapon being a sort of master-class weapon, and the ghostly summon we saw him depicting when he was going after the serial killer in the last episode was, part of that. But then you have a weapon like the one wielded by Krusty's second-in-command taking sort of its own effect, coming to life by its own and using its own will, begs the question, is this playing into, this entire realm? This entire sort of MMORPG aesthetic, is something underlying going on? Is it coming alive? Is there some sort of underground, hidden machinations at work from people of the land? Of course, we did have that play calling back on, a couple episodes back now, where Akatsuki sort of left Lanessia hanging when she was trying to thank Akatsuki for being her friend. And of course, this was still very much when Akatsuki was focused on taking on finding the teachings and the strength and trying to live up to her own sort of casted expectations Shiro might have for her. And I'd noted then that perhaps there'd be sort of a strengthening of the bonds between Lanessia and the people of the land had Akatsuki only just said, I'm welcoming that you consider me a friend, and we are friends, and, this is us together and this kind of stuff, when she was very much dismissive of that. And we have Riaz actually in this episode pretty much picking up the slack for that in the idea, as I said previously, of trying to get Akatsuki, prompting Akatsuki to think beyond just her own sole effort and asking for help, which we see finally happens in this episode. And I feel like it was leaps and bounds in the right sort of direction that I was saying I was afraid Akatsuki had actually backpedaled when she had that interaction with Lanessia, that we're moving forward in this episode, where essentially Lanessia herself has found the will to speak up for Akatsuki. Akatsuki has found the will to speak up for Lanessia, and all of these women surrounding them, Mariel, Henrietta, Riaz, and such like that, are finding the importance of this unity, and they understand that. They don't need Shiro to sort of dictate and operate behind the scenes and manipulate this into action. They're finding it for themselves. They're finding, in essence, their own strength through unifying together, and that's just a very promising lead toward whatever this new inexplicable, thing that's happening, this manipulation to this environment. This may bring them lengths ahead of the game to combat whatever this manipulation is, which, it's going to be, as I say, an overhanging question until the next episode, and this season plays out to see what exactly it all is going to amount to. So, very curiously, we saw Shiro in that limbo that Akatsuki found herself in, and I had to beg the question, one final question for this episode, was this really Shiro? We kind of had the implication that on the raid he's on, we haven't seen any sort of flashes over to what their current status is and everything like that, so it could have been that Shiro had thought beyond himself and found himself in a very precarious position and had himself killed for all intents and purposes. Of course, we had Demikos basically plotting against Shiro all the while, so was it something he did, and this is legitimately Shiro in this limbo deciding to return then, or perhaps because it seems like they're worlds apart, with Shiro off in this dungeon raid and Akatsuki and Akibahara and all this kind of stuff. I would think that they probably wouldn't share a sort of, respawning space, if you will, that kind of thing. But, so I did call into question, was this the real Shiro, or was it just sort of a fantasy of Akatsuki's, or perhaps even whatever the manipulating, overriding factor is playing with Akatsuki's mind, utilizing a comforting figure to sit with her as it's stealing her memories, just loads of questions, being begged by the end of this episode, excited beyond reproach to see where we go from here. I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below, your speculations as to what you think everything amounted to in this episode. And so, yeah, otherwise, I hope you enjoyed the video and that it finds you well, and I'll catch y'all later. Peace.